Okay, today is a special episode for me because this is a topic that I am trying to wrestle with and I am interested in. The main reason I'm interested in this topic is indirect, is through social phenomena. I was looking at a rather difficult set of papers on social epistemology and whether or not social phenomena exists or not. And then someone tells me that you should check a dissertation that somehow helps you with what you are doing and what you are focusing on. So I was like, okay, maybe I should take a look. And before doing that, I was like, has anyone used resources from the social epistemology to argue for something quite close to a response to divine hiddenness? And now, for some reason, I haven't been up to date with the work of Stump, but then I came close in contact with it and I thought, yeah, there does seem to be some themes quite close to like community and responsibility and so on. So I went and did the usual thing I do, going to Google Scholar, setting the keywords and pressing the most recent publications. And I found a great paper by my guest today, Katherine Sweet. Is currently a research fellow at University of Noterdam. And when I was looking at your dissertation, the committee, I mean, that's just impressive. John Greco is the advisor. And for those who are listening, obviously, you know Helen de Cruz, which is like a queen, I think, in the field of philosophy of religion. I love her work. And also Eleanor Stump. So thank you so much for being with us today, Katherine.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm very grateful to be on the show.
We will begin as I always do, which is to kind of know how you ended up in philosophy. I am yet to find someone who was really intent on becoming a philosopher from first day. Mostly it's like changing fields and changing avenues. So yeah, just walk us through your own background. How did you end up in philosophy and why philosophy of religion also?
Yeah, so what you just described is exactly what happened with me. I was sort of jumping around for a while. So I originally started off being as an undergraduate majoring in biochemistry, and my aim was to go to medical school. I Within a couple of years, I was actually in a program, so we were required to shadow physicians and write reports and things like that for this pre-med program. And it was really helpful because it gave me enough insight into the world of medicine to realize that I wanted no part of it. So, but actually, even before that, my journey into philosophy sort of came about also as an undergrad. So in this pre-med program that I was in, we were required to take an introductory logic course. And I fell in love with logic in that class. And so I minored in philosophy pretty much from the start, from my first semester of college. And I became really close with some philosophers in my department, and just decided that's what I wanted to major in. That's what I was really interested in. And chemistry eventually sort of fell away from my interests. So it was all happening around the same time, but there was the negative side of realizing what I didn't want to do, and then the growth into the positive side of what I did want to do. Philosophy of religion in particular is a whole different story that we'd have to go even further back in my life, but I was raised Roman Catholic, and so I've always been interested in questions about God and religious belief. And so when I started taking philosophy courses in college, it was sort of natural for me to work on those topics as an undergrad student. So yeah, and then epistemology is, I really didn't even know what I was doing until I was taking college courses in epistemology, and that's when I realized, oh, okay, so a lot of what I was really interested in terms of philosophy of religion was epistemology of religion, as opposed to, say, metaphysics or something like that. And so that is really my focus in my studies of philosophy of religion. And my dissertation is on social epistemology, but not directly or explicitly connected to my work in philosophy of religion. So yeah, that's the whole story.
You also have a few works under review, and so can you give us a glimpse of what is about to be published and what you're working on?
Yeah, so I am currently working on a paper on social cognition and its connection to interdisciplinary research. So it's becoming more and more common now for people in the sciences to want to do interdisciplinary research with philosophers and theologians. And in fact, I was on a Templeton grant a few years ago where that was actually the primary goal was to sort of bridge science and theology. And so this paper that I've been working on is, in that paper, I argue that basically interdisciplinary collaboration specifically requires this virtue of inquisitiveness into other persons. And that's sort of a prerequisite for being able to collaborate with others across disciplines. Primary reason being, we all have different methodologies that we're using across disciplines. All of the disciplines start off with different background assumptions and the like. And so we really need to cultivate this virtue of inquisitiveness into a person before we start trying to work together on some project. And that will not only help us work on the project together when we get to know each other more in advance, but also getting to know one another will help us recognize the limitations of our project, or realize whether the project is going to be fruitful or not, whether this interdisciplinary work is really worthwhile. So that's one paper in the works. And I'm also just sort of starting in the last couple of months, starting a new research project on relationships and the connection between intellectual activity and human flourishing. So the broad idea there is, I think that relationships are a kind of activity, and I think that there is a core intellectual component to engaging in the activity of relationship or relating to another person. So very, very much connected with the paper that we're going to be talking about today, actually. But yeah, so that's the new project.
Okay, fantastic. And for those who are listening, just to point out something relevant to what Katherine said. So just a quick note that has been a recent follow-up paper by Schellenberg and I think it was Graham Oppie, or yeah, I'm sure what the main person is Schellenberg. They have been arguing for quite a while for more diversification, more interdisciplinary work in philosophy of religion, and I think the most recent one is in the previous issue of European Journal for Philosophy of Religion, and that is something I think that you should check out if you're interested in this, which I hope it happens more. Like, I think this is really useful, the collaborations, importing other aspects of different sciences, or maybe psychology or social sciences, to theology as well, to philosophy of religion. I think it just helps it so much. Like, it's because for some people, the field seems dormant or maybe isolated, and I think these things are really changing it. So this is a really welcome addition, I think. But we're here to talk about Belief, Resistance, and Grace, Stump on Divine Hiddenness, which is the title of your article. So let's get into it. First, let's say that the most, I can't do it justice because Stump has written so much on this, but let me just make it really brief. Stump has developed a quite sophisticated theology, philosophical theology, and has kind of a workaround, or what she thinks is a workaround, for divine hiddenness, while somewhat acknowledging or being accepting of non-resistant non-belief. Okay, so I'm getting ahead of myself as a way to respond to divine hiddenness. So walk us through what divine hiddenness is first.
Okay, so yes, the terminology is really interesting here, because divine hiddenness as a concept, especially in religious experience, has been around for a long time. Medievalists have been talking about divine hiddenness, and this is really interesting because it, at least in that sort of way of understanding it, it presupposes the existence of God. The idea is that someone who has strong religious commitments, or has had really strong religious experiences at some point in her past, she might go through a long period of time where she feels as though she is isolated from God, she's separated from God. And so this way of thinking about divine hiddenness is very different from the focus of the paper that we're talking about, but that is the sort of the original way of thinking. So John Schellenberg comes along and sort of appropriates the terminology for his own argument. So on this new view of divine hiddenness is a supposition about the way the world is, and on that supposition, what's supposed to fall from that, or fall out of that, is that God does not in fact exist. So on this view, divine hiddenness is really just the empirical fact that there are human beings today or throughout history who have not believed in God, right? They have lacked a positive belief in the existence of God. And so that is what we call the problem of divine hiddenness. It's that we see this empirical fact about the world, and there's this problem that arises from that, which is, well, it seems as though on the way the world is, God does not exist. And that is sort of the premise and then the conclusion of Schellenberg's argument. And obviously there's a lot to unpack within that. That is the problem.
So, and let me say, either this is, in my opinion, either this is like one of the most significant advances on the side of a theology, or like one of the pretty much obvious parts of the theistic commitments that can be easily reconciled. In my mind, it's either a big problem or it's no problem at all. So, but I love Stump's approach because it seems to me to be fairly modest, and we will get to it. But you mentioned that, so is it possible for you to explicitly mention the premises and the conclusion, and also you mentioned that the notion of a personal relationship here is important, since it seems obvious that one has some sort of relation to God, whether he believes in God or not. But you say for reasons having to do with the space, you do not discuss this when it comes to your article. So can you please elaborate on its relevance here?
Yes. Yes. So I have my own formulation of Schellenberg's argument. So if it's all right, I'll go through those premises and then I'll get to your second question. So first, what's important to note about Schellenberg's argument is that he's trying to propose an objection to traditional theism. So traditional theism says something like God is omniscient, God is omnipotent, God is perfectly loving, or perfectly good, something in that ballpark. And so premise one is just the conditional that if the traditional theist God exists, then God loves all human beings perfectly. This is actually a sort of taking traditional theism one step further in my view, because we could accept a traditional theism of benevolence, omniscience, and omnipotence without thinking that God either is love or that God is capable of love or something like that. But certainly the Christian view or the Christian version of traditional theism would accept this premise. So if the traditional theist God exists, then God loves all human beings perfectly. Premise two, if God loves someone perfectly, then God is always open to being in a relationship with that someone. And I think Schellenberg thinks that that's intuitive based on our concepts of love and interpersonal relations. Premise three, if God is always open to being in a personal relationship with someone, then it is not the case that said person non-resistantly lacks belief in God. And Schellenberg is going to explicitly defend premise three. So we'll probably get into discussion of that in a minute. And premise four, the last premise, there exists or has existed at least one non-resistant non-believer. And that is exactly just what I mentioned a few moments ago, which is this empirical fact that it seems obvious to people like Schellenberg, at least, that there have been humans throughout history who have lacked belief in God, and perhaps despite wishing that they didn't lack such belief. Now, some in the literature have explicitly rejected premise four, and that is one route that you could take. But if you want to hold to the sort of empirical fact, then you get this conclusion that it is not the case that the traditional theist God exists. So that's the argument as I reformulate it. And to what you're getting at with the sort of notion of an interpersonal relationship, there is a significant difference between the idea of a loving relationship and a relation, right? We might think of it as a metaphysical relation. So suppose the Christian God exists, well, then God created the universe and he created each individual within it. And in fact, if intelligent design is right or something like that, then he had some intention or purpose in creating each individual. He may have sort of instilled some purpose within each of us. Well, just in virtue of those facts, I and you, Ashkan, have a metaphysical relation to God. God is the creator and he created us, and it's and that is the relation. So that's very different from saying that I have a personal relationship or a loving relationship with God, because I could, for instance, acknowledge all of those facts. I could believe in God, and yet I could hate him. I could reject him. I could acknowledge his purpose for me, but I could reject that purpose and go against his desires. So Schellenberg's arguing more crucial than just some metaphysical relation. And in fact, I think it relies implicitly on a sort of Christian way of understanding God, which is that God is a person. God, part of God's nature is personal. And so he is capable of forming a personal relationship with us, and he has a desire to do so. And that doesn't necessarily fall out from the traditional view of God as just omnipotent, omniscient, and even omnibenevolent. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. It's actually really helpful to get a lay of the land also for the audience. So
one way of thinking about it just really quickly is that on this view that Schellenberg is calling traditional theism, or that in the paper I'm calling traditional theism, God desires something not unlike the relationship, or the kind of relationship that a father desires with his child. And so there's at least an analogy there, even if it's going to be a radically different in phenomenological terms or something like that. I think this is what Schellenberg is getting at with the idea of a personal relationship.
Yeah, and also it reminds me of another relevant paper here. If you're interested in this analogy, you have to look up a paper by Stephen Mason, I think, which is called The Limitations of Child-Parent Analogy. I think it's something around along these lines. It's just a fantastic paper on how this can be used both in service of some of the defenses and against some of the defenses and objections to the problem of ego or divine hiddenness. Anyway, Schellenberg's focus on premise 3 is important here. How does he motivate his defense of this premise? So, and feel free to give us, if need be, more detailed elaboration.
Yeah, so premise 3 is really interesting. I framed it in terms of a conditional, which makes it less intuitive, right? It seems less obvious. So just to repeat what premise 3 is, if God is always open to being in a personal relationship with someone, then it is not the case that that person non-resistantly lacks belief in God. Okay, so how is the antecedent even remotely connected to the consequent? Well, again, we have to start off by acknowledging the sort of traditionalist view of God, which is God is all-powerful and all-knowing. Well, if that's the case, and God is all loving, perfectly loving, as Schellenberg puts it, well, then he wants all of those humans who are capable of personal relationship with him, he wants them to believe in him. And in fact, Schellenberg thinks that it's just not possible for humans to have a genuinely loving interpersonal relationship with someone who they take not to exist, or who they do not take to exist, who they do not believe exists. And so the basic idea here is, if God really is open to a relationship with someone, then he's going to do whatever he's capable of doing to make sure that that person believes in him. That's sort of the minimal. That's the baseline of what God would be required to do to play his part in satisfying his own desire. So his desire is for a relationship between himself and another, and there's something that he can do to support or promote the development of that relationship. And that something that he's capable of doing, according to Schellenberg, is making sure that everyone believes in him. Because again, he's all powerful and all knowing. He knows whether we believe in him or not. And there's got to be something that's within his power, or at least Schellenberg thinks, right? Because he's all powerful, there's just got to be something that's within his power to do to make sure that that those who don't believe form a belief. And that's him just playing his role in the development of the relationship, and everything else is up to the human person. And so that is the basic defense of three, because whatever else is left is genuinely up to that person, right? And what's up to that person is for that person either to resist the belief or the desire that they acknowledge God has, or to not resist it. And that's where we get the consequent of the conditional in three, that there just isn't the case. There can't be a case where God is genuinely open to personal relationship, but the fault, the reason that the person lacks belief isn't because of the person. So that's the idea.
This is actually a quite nice bridge for my next question, which is, you mentioned resistance. So let's go through what is meant by resistance and the two type of resistance, non-belief that Schellenberg speaks of, and the fact that can there be non-resistance when the person has the appropriate information? I'm asking this specifically because this has been a running theme quite a long time, I think, in the debate when it comes to divine hiddenness, that look, if you had the information, it's obvious. So that's one reason I think your focus on Stump is actually timely, because Stump is trying to be accommodating to the view as much as possible and have a realistic outlook. And I should also mention here that for those who are not willing to grant the possibility of non-resistant non-believers, and maybe you want to look at another paper by Paul Moser, I think, in the same journal, European Journal for Philosophy of Religion, that he argues that there is no such thing as non-resistant non-believers. So that's one route that you can follow. Okay, let's get back to the resistance and the type of non-resistant non-beliefs.
Yeah, so this part is interesting within the sort of Schellenberg's own trajectory, because he has changed his views, or he's at least nuanced the terminology with respect to non-belief. So the at least the most up-to-date, the newest version of Schellenberg's view is that resistant non-belief is not equivalent to culpable or blameworthy non-belief. And this is important because it might change our intuitions with respect to the state of affairs, the empirical data. So if the question is, well, is everyone who lacks belief in God blameworthy for that? Well, that's pretty obviously no. But what Schellenberg wants to say actually is culpability or blameworthiness doesn't even really matter. It's not part of the question that we're asking. What we're really interested in is, can we explain, or is our explanation of non-belief solely placed on something about the agent, the epistemic agent in question. So when we ask the question, why does this person lack a belief in God? If the answer to that question is, or can be described solely in terms of that person, then that person is resistant. Their non-belief is due to something that they are the cause of. And so the way that Schellenberg describes it is a resistant non-believer is someone who is unwilling to even look at all of the relevant facts or at all of the information that's necessary. So they've shut their eyes to the light of God, I think is how Schellenberg says it. And that's resistance, right? So if, on the other hand, if the answer to the why question, why does this person not believe? Well, is it because they don't have enough evidence to support the belief? Or is it, is it because some other extraneous circumstances happened in their life, have sort of prevented them, they've blocked off their ability to even engage with the evidence? Like maybe the evidence is staring them in the face, but they can't make it coherent, or they can't connect all of the evidence together in the right way. Well, then they're not resistant. So if there's a person like that throughout human history, if there's a person who really doesn't have sufficient evidence to form a belief, and maybe they're looking for it, or maybe they just can't put all the evidence together in the right way, then they're not resisting, right? So they're a non-resistant non-believer. And just to really focus in on the important difference here is that Schellenberg thinks there are plenty of resistant non-believers who are not culpable. So just to take one example, suppose that a child was abused by her uncle when she was younger, and her uncle happens to be her father's identical twin brother, so they look exactly alike. Well, she might grow up, she might spend her entire life being unable to form a relationship with her father, even though her father is loving and desires a close relationship with her, and he never did anything wrong to her. We could even suppose that he, did whatever it took to stop the uncle. But she might resist forming a connection with her father because of the psychological damage that was caused by the abuse of her uncle. She's not responsible for any of that psychological damage, but she is resistant to the relationship with her father. The resistance is hers, or the best way to say it, so the analogy point shows, is the answer to the why question of why doesn't she have a loving relationship with her father. That question can be answered solely by describing her state, the kind of person that she is, or the kind of past that she had. So she is resistant to the relationship. Her father is not resistant, but she's not blameworthy for that resistance. And that's what's really important for Schellenberg, because a lot of people have tried to make an objection to the view or to the argument by trying to say, well, it's just obvious that people aren't culpable for all of their lack of belief, but this has nothing to do with God forming a relationship, or God might have reason not to form a relationship with someone things like that. So resistant non-belief is not equivalent to culpable non-belief.
The next thing that you go on to talk about really briefly is the rejection of premise 4. We've talked about this already, so I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on it. Just to say that Stump actually acknowledges the possibility of that this could be true, but you also point people to other directions for other people who reject this possibility. So your goal, you say, is that there is another response, which is the response by people like Stump, that is kind of in tension with the kind of maneuver or strategy that she has in answering divine hiddenness. So what is that before we get into your main goal, which is focusing on Stump's solution? Can you walk us through what is Stump's proposed solution to the divine hiddenness problem and her objection to premise 3 of the argument?
Yeah, definitely. So her rejection of premise 3 is really a way of rejecting any kind of propositional knowledge as a requirement for a personal relationship. So it's not even just about premise 3. So if you recall, premise 3 says, if God is always open to being in a personal relationship with someone, then it is not the case that said person non-resistantly lacks belief in God. And her rejection of this is really a rejection of the idea that personal relationships require beliefs or propositional attitudes at all. So a child can have an infant, for instance, who doesn't have, we might think, that an infant doesn't have propositional attitudes. Even a child can have a loving relationship with her mother, and she can know her mother. It's true to say that an infant who lacks any kind of language still knows her mother in a non-propositional way. And so Stump's solution relies on this idea of a knowledge of a person, which Stump thinks is not reducible or even explained in terms of propositional knowledge. And once we see, according to Stump, once we see that knowledge of a person, knowing a person doesn't have anything to do with knowing about the person, knowing them by description or knowing their attributes. Once we see that, then it becomes clear that all kinds of non-believers, even outright atheists, can know God and can have personal relationship with God on the basis of knowing him non-propositionally. And one thing that helps too here, I think, is seeing, I think the intuitive force behind this is seeing believers and their relationship or with what they take to be God. So there are people in every organized religion who have false beliefs about not just God simpliciter on the assumption that God exists, but they have false beliefs about what they take to be God according to their own religious precepts. And yet it seems ridiculous to say that if their God exists, if the God of their religion exists, they don't have a personal relationship with that God. If anyone has a personal relationship with that God, it's the people who are participating in the religion in question. And so I think that helps to motivate the idea that we really can have relationships with people, even with false beliefs about them, or even without having the concept of them at all.
So just to be clear here, are you, what I'm interested in is to know, are you willing to accept and affirm along with Stump, that yes, knowledge of persons is not reducible to propositional knowledge, or are you kind of going with it for the sake of the argument?
I'm going with it in this paper. I'm going with it for the sake of the argument. To be honest, I am skeptical of the idea, but what I do want to say is, I think there is a kind of awareness of a person, qua person, that is not best described as a kind of knowledge at all. So maybe that's just a terminological issue that I have with Stump. But I do think there may be something foundational to loving relationships that isn't knowledge, but some other kind of intellectual, some other kind of result from an intellectual activity that we shouldn't be describing it as knowledge, but it is a kind of awareness. And I think if we're willing to take up the concept of a person, which in itself is a sort of weird idea, if we think there really are persons and this really is a significant category and humans really do fit the bill of persons, then I don't think it's that much further of a step to say there's some kind of recognition of a person as a person, that has nothing to do with me, forming beliefs or even thinking at all, maybe. And I think the word knowledge gives off this idea of, I've thought about it. And even if there's a kind of knowledge that doesn't require belief or doesn't require or doesn't have an object as a proposition, even then it gives off the sort of implication that we're thinking, or that we did think, and that this was the outcome of our thinking.
So it's fair to say that there is more than a terminological difference between you and Stump on this. Even the phenomenological perceptions of what you are willing to concede and keep are different. But okay, anyway, you assume this for the sake of argument, and you still say you're not convinced by it. Why not?
So the basic idea in the paper is, I think even if we just take for granted everything that Stump wants to throw at us, we can concede all of that, and yet we can tell a new story. We can revise Schellenberg's argument and tell a new story that just brings up the problem all over again. And this is where the idea of having the concept of God comes into play. So if we accept that God really wants a loving personal relationship with us, and he's all powerful and he's omniscient, well, suppose we have a person who has never even come across the word God or the concept of divinity at all. But, they grew up on this island and they're living there and they feel really closely connected with nature. If God is all powerful and omniscient, then it seems as though he would probably try to instill certain beliefs in this person so that the person doesn't form false beliefs about, something like pantheism being true or something like that. But even if we grant that maybe God has reason not to interfere, with this person's life, as soon as someone else comes onto the scene, as soon as this person interacts with a Christian or a traditional theist of sorts, that person is now going to have new concepts. And if he doesn't incorporate those concepts accurately into his own experience, or into his own world, and incorporates them with his past experiences of nature, if he doesn't do that, then it seems as though he's resistant, right? If he says, well, your Christian thing, that's fine, that's good for you, but I'm going to stick with, what I know about nature and life form, and everything is, kind of connected, and that kind of thing. Well, if the Christian God is right, then the Christian God would not want him to form false beliefs. And upon hearing these accurate religious claims, God would desire for him to form true beliefs about him. And so if he doesn't do that, then at minimum, he's resisting those beliefs. He's resisting those claims, and God has a desire for him to not resist those claims. And by the way, he has a loving personal relationship with God, which means that because God is omnipotent and they're in a relationship, God can do whatever he can to satisfy his desire, and his desire is for this person to form true beliefs based on the new concepts that he's hearing. So this is just a new version of the same old problem, because it seems clear that there are people who are not resistant, and yet they have the concept of God, or they have the concept of the Christian God in particular, and they don't accept it. Either they accept something else that's radically different and inconsistent, or they're agnostic, or they're atheist.
One of my problems with Stump's solution and to this appeal to descriptions is a worry that I have when it comes to the switching of the nouns between proper nouns. So it seems to me that the God we're talking about is definitely a proper noun, like a big G, capital G, And it seems to me, at least in my reading, it seems that Stump kind of misses the mark for this reason too. Like the description we are focused on is not just any description. It's just a really specific one that we want. So do you agree with this? What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, no, I think that's right. And it also sheds light on a serious problem with Stump's account, which is that it seems clear that while a person can form a relationship with someone, even while having false beliefs about them, or even without having the concept of God or something like that, even if that's possible, it's deficient in some way. And its deficiency can be removed, right? It can be made better because one of the persons in the relationship has so much power. And so, to your point about sort of the difference between the proper noun and the common noun, if someone does have a relationship with the proper noun, but maybe they have a relationship that's founded on all of these descriptions that are really false about that proper noun, right? About God, capital G. Well, then God, capital G, would have a desire to improve the epistemic state of the person in question, hopefully by helping them realize that all of these descriptive beliefs they have are false.
Now, I have a lot more to say here, because ever since back then that I was thinking about this article, I have new objections and problems with this line of thinking, but I will keep that until the end so that first, in the interest of time, we can go on consistently. The reason I bring this up is because I think this is consistent with your criticism. And you say, and I have to quote you here, it says, consider the scope of the claim that any and all non-believers throughout history were or are resistant to God in some way. However difficult it will be to defend this claim, it is not much more difficult than providing evidence for the following weaker claim. Everyone who has the concept of the Christian God available to help and still remains a non-believer is resistant to God in some way. I think it's correct when you point out the scope of the claim. It seems that Stump is aimed at a proper concept of God, but moves ambiguously between these concepts, as you mentioned. But also, there are some, so the something that everyone believes in, or the thing that all of these descriptions are identifying, some of them are not identifying proper objects of worship. For example, if we think about some of the descriptions of God, which of the images which have caused some people or motivated some people, for example, to form euthyphral dilemmas and the arbitrary objections, are kind of things that they do by citing different verses from the Bible or the Quran, and they say this description doesn't seem to be, at least prima facie, what is attractive. And this could be from even a religious community that provides them the information. So yeah, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. To be fair to Stump, I think she might respond by saying, well, yeah, I mean, I said that, knowledge of God is possible without propositional beliefs, but I never said that whatever our propositional beliefs about gods or God are, that those actually have to be consistent with our sort of fundamental relationship with God. So this is a really interesting issue.
The fact that we have desire. Now remember, the desire is not our aim. The desire is the description under which the object is desirable. And that's my problem. If the description of the object of desire is not desirable, then forget about propositional commitments.
Yes. So let's think about a potential response from her in a little bit differently. So consider a person who believes the worst things about God. Their religion is just horrid. Any moral thinker would reject almost every moral claim made by it. But this person accepts this religion wholeheartedly. And so every descriptive belief that they have about God is just abhorrent. Okay. They think that they have a relation, that person thinks that she has a relationship with God. I'm continuing to use quotations because we're talking about what's being described propositionally. So that person thinks that she has a relationship with God. But really, on her best days and her best moments, she is just highly aware of the physical beauty in the world. And in fact, she can also detect beauty in taste, perceptions, and things like that. So she's like really good at detecting certain kinds of beauty in the world. I think Stump's response has to be basically, this person has propositional beliefs that are so disconnected from her true relationship with God that we can't even talk about them as being related to one another, right? So she not only has false beliefs about God, but she has false beliefs about her relationship with God. She has false beliefs about her religion's relationship with God, right? So suppose she thinks she's only going to heaven because, she goes to this church every week, but the church is, doing these horrible things to people. Well, she just has a radically false belief about what her relationship is with God. And actually what I think Stump would have to say is she has a relationship with God, but she doesn't even recognize it. She couldn't recognize it if you pointed it out to her. If you said, did you know that, all of these times that you've sensed beauty in the world, that was like the closest you ever got to God? She would say, no, absolutely not. That has nothing to do with God. And, God is this guy who rains hellfire down or whatever it is. So I think on Stump's view, you can have a relationship with God without recognizing that you're even the nature of your relationship, and without recognizing that you have a relationship at all. Not sure if that actually is a sufficient response, but it's the best one I can think of.
It's okay. We will come back to this. It's not every day that I get a research fellow at Noterdam to talk to you about this. So let me count my blessings and continue with the time that you have afforded me. So, and then if there's time at the end, I will come back to this. Now, okay. So far, what has happened is, Storm has told us, okay, you can't reduce this type of knowledge of persons, okay, to propositional knowledge, okay. And now she believes that she has shown the premise 3 to be false, but you revise the premise in some way, and her way of responding is the doctrine of divine simplicity combined with the doctrine of correlative transcendentals. She argues that in knowing goodness or sensing beauty, just what you mentioned, a person is also knowing God to one degree or another, and concludes that from a person's sincere self-report that he does not believe in an omniscient, omnipotent, perfectly good God, it does not follow that he does not know God, capital G, no quotations here, in any way or to any degree. So in summary, then you say you're not convinced again. Why not?
Yes. Okay. So just to sort of recap my objection, I think that Stump sort of foresaw an objection the way that I propose it. So I sort of revise Schellenberg's argument, weaken it a little bit, and say, okay, but the people with the concept of the Christian God, those people have to be resistant, right? We can't admit that anyone who's ever heard of the Christian God is non-resistant without rejecting the existence of God. I think she sort of foresaw this coming because, as you just quoted her, she sort of concludes her discussion by saying, well, by the way, it doesn't really matter, what concepts you have, because you could even disbelieve in God. You could have all of these false beliefs, but as long as you sort of know what goodness is, as long as you're sort of connected to certain universals, then you do know God, at least to some degree. Now, what's interesting about the quotation that you just mentioned is she doesn't actually say what degree of knowledge of God is necessary for forming a personal relationship with him. So this is my final explanation for why I am not convinced. suppose the idea of transcendentals is right. Suppose that God is correlative with goodness and being. Okay. Just because I have some connection with goodness or some connection with existence, right, with being, doesn't mean that I have enough knowledge of God to have a personal relationship with him. And so I'm just not convinced that a person could have a personal relationship with something or someone that that person either doesn't take to be a person or takes not to be a person, right? So going back to the example of the person on an island who feels really connected, intimately connected with nature, that isolated person has no belief that God is personal, right? So that person has some really close connection to nature, but he can't form a personal relationship with nature because he doesn't even understand nature as being a person. And that is my problem with trying to say, well, really everyone has some knowledge of God, because God is equivalent to being. And even just the tiniest little amount of knowledge of God is good enough to form a relationship with him. I don't think that's true. I think we need a much more robust knowledge of God. In fact, if God is personal, then we need to have knowledge of God as a person. That's the kind of knowledge of God, even if it's non-propositional. Again, granting her point, we need to have knowledge of God as a person in order to form a personal relationship with him. And so having knowledge of beauty, or God qua beauty, or God qua goodness, something like that, that's not going to be sufficient.
Okay, so you say that this account of grace that Stump has. So do we want to say anything about the account of grace that Stump has before moving on to saying that what your problem is with it? Because you say the conclusion is that Stump is committed to the claim following the account of grace that she offers, that non-belief of the certain kind described that you're describing entails resistance to God, but in order to fully describe the theistic problem of free will and Stump's account of grace, we should take a slight detour. So let's do that. Let's give us why the motivation behind the account of grace and what its connection is to the free will before going on to the relationship and human free will.
Okay. Yes. So this is a wild detour away from so just to try to keep it as short as possible, the basic problem of grace, at least Christian grace, is this. Christians think that human beings have free will. And in fact, a lot of Christians think we have they have an incompatibilist conception of free will. So it's sort of a robust idea of what human free will is. But they also accept that God is goodness itself. Okay, this is the idea of the transcendentals. So God is goodness, God is being, and all the others. But if God is goodness itself, then anything good in the world is dependent on God. So it either emanates from God or it's causally dependent in some way. There's only one way to understand the good in the world, and that is ultimately or foundationally by looking back to God, because God is goodness. So question then, the problem then, is how can humans have free will to do anything other than bad? Seems as though if humans have free will, then what they're free to do, what they are free to will is bad things. But they're not free to will anything good, because anything good that they will is actually sourced in God. And so that's really the whole problem, is how can we understand free will and what's often called God's grace here, where on the Christian conception, it's God's grace that sort of connects us up with God's nature. God's grace is what allows us to do good things in the world, because God is goodness. And Stump, in other work separate from the work she's done on Divine Hiddenness, in other work she argues that the solution to this problem is to acknowledge a third state of the will. So in fact, she sort of admits, hey, look, the will is not technically free to do the specific good things that humans do, but the freedom comes just before all the good things, and it's in fact dependent. All the good things are dependent on this free action that comes before them, and she calls that quiescence. And so the idea is humans are free to do bad things, and humans are free to refrain from doing bad things. And when humans do that, they're in a state of quiescence, and God can infuse grace in persons when they're in a state of quiescence, and they can accept God's grace, and then thereby go and participate in God's nature by doing good things in the world and developing virtues by doing those good things. So she doesn't actually make a connection. In this paper, I am trying to make that connection. What's really what the paper is sort of has two different goals. One is to show that Stump's objection to premise 3 of Schellenberg's argument is not sufficient. But the whole motivation behind objecting to premise 3, according to Stump, was saving premise 4. Premise 4 was the empirical fact, you might recall. It was just the idea that it seems clear that there are some humans who are non-resistant non-believers, and Stump wants to save that premise. And in this sort of second to last part of my paper, I'm trying to show that her account of grace cannot save premise 4. It's inconsistent with premise 4. And so it doesn't really matter how much work she puts into the rest of Schellenberg's argument or her objections to it. Even if her objection to premise 3 were successful, it doesn't change the fact that she can't save premise 4. Her account of grace is incompatible with the seeming empirical facts on the ground.
Okay, walk us through the inconsistency that you speak of.
Okay, so the inconsistency, the main issue with the account of grace is that it doesn't allow for a person to lack a belief without either God refusing to offer grace. Remember, as we talked about, different terminology when we were talking about it from the perspective of Schellenberg. But here we're talking about grace, which is God has this desire for us to do something. or be some way or believe something. And he can use grace to help us. So my objection is the account of grace either requires acknowledging that sometimes God refuses to offer grace with respect to infusing a belief in us or making sure in some other way that we have a belief, or the view requires that anyone who lacks belief and has the concept of God has to move into a state of refusal of grace, which is a kind of resistance. And so either we get a rejection of premise 4, where anyone who lacks belief is resistant in some way, because their state of will, they're not in a state of quiescence, and they're not accepting all of God's infused grace. So they're technically, according to Stump's terminology, they are refusing grace. And if we really aren't willing to accept that, then implausibly, in my view, we have to accept that for whatever reason, God has a desire for us to believe something, but he isn't acting on that desire, even though he and I have a relationship, and I've been accepting his grace up to that point. So I was in a state of quiescence. I've shifted, I've accepted his grace, we formed a relationship, but now he has just decided not to offer me the grace necessary to improve that relationship. Because again, as I mentioned before, even if we accept all of Stump's views about knowledge of persons being non-reducible, it has to be admitted that false beliefs about a person are a kind of deficiency in a relationship. And if we can improve on that deficiency, then what we want to do is trade our false beliefs for true beliefs. And that's where God's grace would come into play. And just to give you one example, in case it's not obvious, that claim, consider a child who takes herself to have a loving relationship with her father, and her father is in fact really good to her. He takes care of her, but she finds out later in her life that he had this whole other life and family that he lived with only occasionally, not even enough to make it where she felt like he was gone all the time or anything, but he just had this whole other life that she didn't know about. Seems obvious that their relationship is deficient in some way, precisely because she had false propositional beliefs about her father and she lacked true ones, even if she had some sort of non-propositional knowledge of her father that was sort of crucial to the relationship overall.
Well, ever since after writing this article, can you think of any other, before getting to the potential responses that you have already covered in the article, have you thought of any other potential responses?
I really haven't, but I'd be interested to hear any that you might have.
Okay, so let's first cover what you've already covered. You mentioned from a stump goes like this. The example that you describe is not really possible for if someone ever has the correct information about God's nature or that person that you were saying, then she cannot help but believe that God exists, and those who are lost Christians are not lost in quotations, are not so because they become non-believers after receiving a proper Christian upbringing and came to reject it, but rather because for those who are non-culpable, at least at some point in their lives, they become misinformed about Christianity or perhaps God's nature in such a way that their false beliefs about Christianity and God led them down a path of skepticism and non-belief or outright disbelief. What they reject is someone or something which they do not truly understand. So any person who seeks union with God, rather than rejecting his offers to be in close relationship, when provided with true descriptions of God, would immediately yes and then accept God's grace, which would result in the formation of belief in God and union with God. So both your example that you just gave us and the situation solved, this is over with.
So I think the main problem with this response is that it entails implausibly that non-culpable non-Christians have an inaccurate understanding of the Christian God. And I think there are plenty of cases in which a person might actually alter their beliefs about God precisely because they gain more understanding or greater understanding about the Christian depictions or the theological claims made by Christians. So just to give one example, suppose that Catholic theology is right. There are plenty of sort of lapsed Catholics who have shifted towards Protestantism because they reject things like transubstantiation. And as a child, it could be argued, obviously, that you don't understand this view. You just have a sort of false understanding of it. But actually, a lot of people who were raised Catholic fall away from Catholicism as they gain an understanding about what transubstantiation really entails and really means. And so it just seems obvious to me that, that it's not about, oh, well, this person just must have all of these false beliefs, and that's what explains their lack of belief in God's existence.
Just to make this really concrete, as an example, you can look at the book called Divine Properties, I think, by Graham Oppy. Graham Oppy is a naturalist. You don't get anyone who's more naturalist than him. But it seems odd to me, given what he has written when it comes to models of God and Christianity, that he is somehow misinformed. So yeah, I think this also seems unsatisfying to me. But then there's another response that perhaps it could be that a non-believer can have a personal relationship with God without believing in God as he truly is. So maybe this person has just radically false propositional beliefs about God, but it still has a deep relationship with him. So having false beliefs about important matters, maybe including perhaps God's nature or existence, doesn't then exclude this person, because who cares if different persons or religions have these conflicting propositional commitments? The interpersonal relationship can still be saved with the same God. Maybe they understand it differently. This is something which I am not emphatically in favor of, but it reminds me of commitments of people who are in the same boat as people like D.Z. Phillips, and people who take this kind of language game approach, Wittgensteinian approach, to say that, look, it's just all different religions are true. It's just that the appearance is different and the content is the same. So yeah, maybe they lack propositional beliefs, but they still have a relationship. So what do you think of this response?
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. There's the idea of like perennialism or something like that that can explain. So in the paper, my basic response is to distinguish between what I take to be genuine non-believers, and people who might be merely sort of labeled non-believers just because they don't follow, or their beliefs don't conform to some religious ideology or some particular theological um, set of theological claims. And so just to go back to the example of the isolated person on the island, even that person does have a belief in the existence of nature, right? That person feels closely connected with nature, however he understands it. And if you asked him, maybe he didn't have the propositional attitude before, but if you asked him, he would think about it and accept it and say, of course, I believe, in such and such. And I do this in the morning, in my on my island, and it's just obvious to me that that means there's something there, right? There's something there. And so he believes in the existence of whatever it is that he feels connected to. And I think that's not even really a robust kind of non-resistant uh, non-believer, because of that sort of underlying acceptance of something to which one is related to. Now, in that kind of case, obviously, we lack a personal or an interpersonal relationship, and so that's a separate argument. But I think it might be misleading to call that kind of person a non-believer just on that basis alone. And so in any kind of case where we would say, well, this person is an atheist or this person is an agnostic, but it's true that they have some kind of union with God, that person is not a non-believer in the sense relevant to Schellenberg's argument, because if there's a genuine relationship, then upon questioning that person would be able to acknowledge the relationship in question, and in acknowledging that, they would be able to acknowledge something external to themselves to which they're intimately related.
And I think just for the audience, it's really important your emphasis on the robust non-belief. Like, we're not talking here, we're not focused, or at least it seems that even Schellenberg could be said to be not focused on like lay people who, for whatever reason, find themselves outside of the fold. We're talking about people who have had some understanding, some reading, some awareness of what the Christian, or pick your favorite proper noun, God, have. And we're talking about that kind of non-belief. But maybe another potential response is, okay, you say on Stamp's account, resistance to God, culpable or not, is constitutive of a will that is not conformed to God's will. Quiescence of the will requires a person to cease resisting. A will conformed to the good requires continuous non-resistance to God. These exhaust the possibilities. So the claim that non-resistant non-belief is possible might be interpreted as the claim that one can have a will conform to God's will, while at the same time lacking a belief in the existence of God. So this, I have to come clear, this kind of was the least convincing to me. But okay, what do you think of the third response before I jump in?
Yeah, so I think first, I think this is actually one way of framing a really common response to Schellenberg's argument, which is well, we don't know God, right? We have a relationship with him, we know him, but we don't know all of the things that he knows, right? And so we couldn't possibly assume or think that God's will, would really be for us to have true beliefs about him, right? He's so beyond us. He has all of these other reasons for maybe not having a will that aims for us to have true beliefs. Okay, so it might be possible for a person to have a will conformed to God's will while also lacking belief, precisely because God's will is for us to continue lacking a belief. And so I think that's really important, because that is one route that a lot of theists take in responding to Schellenberg. And I want to, as a response to it, I want to fall back on the nature of personal relationships. I think that really is the core of the problem with this sort of Christian version of traditional theism, is the idea of God as personal, and having a desire to form personal relationships with us, because it seems pretty obvious to me that it doesn't matter how much knowledge a father has, that goes well beyond his child's awareness. I can't think of a reason why a father would ever want his child to not believe in him, if at least the purpose or the end, the aim, is to strengthen and maintain the personal relationship, right? So a father might have some sort of sacrificial reason for making it the case that his child thinks that he's dead or doesn't exist or whatever it might be, right? We can think of all kinds of cases like that. But if the whole goal, if heaven really just is being in union with God, and if life on earth really just is trying to imperfectly, though it may be, imperfectly achieve that goal of union with God, then what sort of extraneous reason could go beyond that goal? Because it's certainly inhibiting the achievement of that goal for God to not have a will that desires us to form a belief in him.
Yeah, that doesn't, I don't know why, but this third response just completely missed me. But you're right, it is along the lines of the most common responses that is utilized in the literature. Now, before I move any further, is there anything that has been missed and you want to mention?
I don't think so.
Okay, so let's now go back to the objection that I had, and you tried a response on behalf of Stump. Now, your response was epistemological, and that wasn't my point. I'm saying let's separate for now the epistemology from the metaphysics. Assume that you have different descriptions for the object that you desire a relationship with. Now, epistemologically, sure, we could say descriptions could be enough. But the problem is the description under which you have an object can render it desirable or undesirable to you. And if you have different desires, the description is different. And if you're giving your descriptions from a religious community, it seems to me that there is actually quite a big chance, like that's just common sense, that you might be getting the wrong description. So the question is, could you have a relationship even if everything is epistemologically sound and correct and description is fine for having a relationship? even forgetting about the proper noun and the common noun distinction, just forgetting all of that, you have to be able to recognize the satisfaction conditions of your desire. It's about something, right? There's a sense of intentionality in your desire. So in its metaphysics, you have to know what satisfies this, and you have to recognize the object in order for yourself to understand that your object has been satisfied. Now, it could be possible that you don't know that the object of your desire has been satisfied, has been met. But the problem is, if you don't know it, you might replace it with another description. So my problem is not epistemological when it comes to Stump. It's rather metaphysical, because I think that the something, in quotation marks for those who are listening and not seeing my fingers, is referentially opaque. It could be that you are in a relationship with something, whatever that something is, right? Different groups of communities recognize this something, again in quotation marks, as a different thing. But while it is true that all of them are pointing to the same thing, to the same something, again it's a something in quotations, it's not true that they are pointing to the same thing. This time no quotation. So the something gives you different truth values based on the description that you substitute for it, meaning that your own desire. So there are two sets of perspectives here, right? There's one God's perspective, and the other is human creature perspective. My problem is that with this account is on the level of metaphysics of human creatures towards God, because they could have a description or many different descriptions, but that's not knowing the same thing. That's just referentially opaque. So that's my main problem with Stump's account. So what do you think of this worry?
Yeah, no, I think that's a big problem, especially because a lot of the descriptions are opposed to one another too. But I think that Stump's reply would just be that all of the kind of knowledge of God that she's trying to get at isn't even something that can be gained via participating in all of these religious rituals, at least not the false ones or something like that, but rather the knowledge of God that's sort of conducive to building relationship is something that can only be gained by and this is where it gets me, but but it can only be gained by actually sort of having an awareness of God in your actions, right? In your good actions, you have an awareness of goodness, or in beautiful things, you have an awareness of beauty. I mean, that's the only thing I can think of, is that it's so radically separate from the descriptions that you think are accurate about God. Your relationship is not only not dependent on those things, but in fact, your relationship with God can be inhibited by those false descriptions that you have from that you've gained from your religious community. Then at least the reference is fixed, because each one of us is individually coming to have knowledge of God, but it's all via different particulars, but our knowledge is all of the universal, right?
I would disagree with that again, because I think the object is the description here. it's not the object is not what we take it. Rather, it's rather the description under which we take the object to be desirable or not. And so different descriptions are not pointed towards the same object of desire. That's because we're talking about descriptions. So that's my problem still. I don't understand how this solves the worry.
Well, she doesn't think that knowledge of a person is knowledge by description, or even knowledge by acquaintance, as Russell would have said. So it's not. It's something radically different. It's something radically different.
I understand that this is what Stump believes, but my point is that from human creaturely perspective, Stump's description is just one description among many that takes these beauty and stuff like that to be the universal of the object that we're talking about. But what if this isn't the correct description? So that's, again, I don't understand how this is supposed to solve the issue. I think the only way that this response could be helpful is to assume the metaphysics of this particular line of thought, and then once you're inside this, you can use a Stump's thought or response to respond like this. But if you're coming from the outside and you have to look at different descriptions, different theories, different models of God, then that's not the same thing. My problem mostly with theism is explanation. The moment I want it to have content, it seems to me that it runs out of content. So at the exact moment that I want to push it for content, it's like there is no content, or it's radically different. And that's one of my main worries. So, but here's one other thing. Look, if you can work with descriptions of God and be in relationship with God, it seems that there are descriptions of God under which the object or the object of your relationship will not be desirable as you want it to be. But the problem is this, as I am thinking of, throughout history, there have been people and religious communities who have had false relationships, as it were. Now, place yourself as a non-resistant non-believer, right? I'm referring to a recent paper by Aaron Rizzieri. I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly. It's titled "How to Make the Problem of Divine Hiddenness Worse." And basically, really crudely, the point is that, look, if there is all of these kinds of false orientations towards God and relationships towards God, and the price of this false relationship is just incomparable to anything that you can imagine. It's such an important good, such a big value to have. The reason that these false descriptions or false relationships have not been decreasing or have been around for a long time gives us some sort of reason to think that maybe hiddenness is true. Because if you want a relationship with someone and you want them to have a good relationship with you, this is not the set of data that we should be expecting. We should expect the person to ward off misinformation, as it were. Like, suppose COVID-19, right? You want people to have good, proper information. And if you're ruling a nation, or you're overseeing someone, or you're a parent, you try your best to do that. So yeah, that seems to me to make some sort of connections towards the moral commitments of God. So that's one thing. And another thing is, there's another paper called A New Argument for a New First Perspective Argument for Atheism, which tries to put divine hiddenness in terms of epistemic probabilities, saying, look, I'm doing all the right things that, for example, Christian community X is telling me to do for a long time. And it's not me thinking that I have to do these things because these things would be good, but rather people who have felt the grace and who are, as it were, the authorities on these topics have told me to do these things. And I have been doing them for a long time, but I just don't feel like I'm becoming a better person or I am in relationship with someone. So that's the epistemic side. So first, my question is, what do you think of Rizieri's idea that this misinformation could be problematic, like morally speaking? And also, what do you think of the epistemic aspect, first perspective aspect? You forget about some people who are informed about this or not, like historically, the empirical fact. But maybe epistemically speaking, an agent finds himself in a situation that they have paid proper and enough attention to a set of commitments, the religious commitments, but they still don't feel the connection or the relationship. The reason I'm asking this is because it has some sort of implications for Pascal's wager, which is another thing I'm really interested in. And so I would love to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, no, I think both of those ideas are really interesting. And to the first point, I think there's, especially on the traditional theist view, there's got to be a problem with the mere fact that so many people are so wildly uninformed about not just religious claims, but all kinds of claims, moral claims, empirical. And if we think that, if you either think God or you accept the correlative nature of the transcendentals, one of the transcendentals is truth. So God is truth. If you think either of those things, then it does seem as though there's a problem. Either people are so highly deficient in their personal relationship with God that they lack so much truth in their lives, or again, God's will is such that just because he's omniscient doesn't mean that he has any interest in making sure that we sort of gain knowledge. And so I think this is the real problem with connecting the dot between God's omniscience and God's omnibenevolence. I mean, some people have argued that basically God doesn't have the same moral requirements that we humans do. And so understanding God as goodness shouldn't imply that God needs to do the good things that we think would be good to do, or that maybe in fact are good to happen. So for instance, if maybe it would be really great if everyone who was really smart, or everyone who had all of this important knowledge shared it, and if our main focus was trying to get people to have true beliefs about the world. But if God is so radically different from us that he isn't sort of bounded by our moral principles, then even though that's good for us to try to share truth, it might not be something that he needs to do or ought to do. I find that pretty implausible, but it is one route that you could take, and that is actually the stronger claim of saying, well, God doesn't need to try to help us out with any knowledge. And so then what sort of falls out from that really easily is God doesn't need to try to help us to understand religious knowledge, right? Theological claims. So,
And I think one of the main reasons I'm not okay and I don't find it plausible is not just because of my naturalistic tendencies, but most specifically because I don't see how the probability direction, like finding goodness and grace and stuff like this in the world, the beauty of the nature, we could attribute that, epistemically speaking, from our own understanding and then predicate that probability, whatever the probability is, in support of God as a moral good to God. I think it just has a big epistemological cost to it that I wouldn't be willing to grant that. And it has hints of Thomism, which, to be honest, I'm not really sympathetic to. But we've talked about a stump, so let me ask you this now. Do you take something? Oh, by the way, I have to mention this here that, of course, neither Katherine nor me, we're not implying that all these objections are just final and theism is just finished. We're done. Let's go home, and we're all atheists right now. Of course, these are complicated issues. This isn't how things are moving. Even if you had a successful logical argument, at least this is my position, I don't think it matters. Like, let's say you have a successful divine hiddenness argument, logically, deductively follows. So what? The theists can always go back to their initial commitment, theories, and just update their theory. Like, so what? I don't think in that respect that atheist, agnostics, or theists are irrational simply because of their disagreement. I think people can reasonably disagree. But anyway, now back to you. So what are your thoughts on divine hiddenness? Do you find a certain response more plausible in your own mind?
A response to the problem, you mean?
The divine hiddenness problem.
Yes. I mean, so I have to admit, I don't have strong beliefs about the existence of God. I'm sort of open to to different ideas, but I do think that the problem of divine hiddenness is a real issue, especially for Christians. And I think I sort of alluded to this earlier, but my own response is to sort of think, well, God probably isn't personal. And in fact, I think that's a lot more compatible with naturalism than any other version of theism. So I just think I think if you have to allege something, right? If you have to accept theism for whatever reason, it's a huge leap from a generic version of deism or something like that to a theological doctrine that alleges that God is a person and that he created human beings to be sort of persons in at least in some way similar to himself. I think there's a big leap to be made there, and I don't think that we need that leap. And I think that setting that aside is a really easy way to respond to the problem of divine hiddenness. I don't think anything Schellenberg says gets off the ground when we drop that concept from God's nature. On the other hand, saying something like, well, God is not personal, really doesn't solve other problems in the literature on philosophy of religion. It doesn't solve the problem of evil. And so if we want a sort of unified picture of God that can solve all of our problems for us, then that's probably not the best route. But yeah, I think I also, just in a biased way, I feel less strength of conviction that the problem of evil is a genuine problem, whereas I'm more convinced that the problem of divine hiddenness is a real problem for Christians.
Right. I actually used to think the other way around, and I have changed my mind on this. Yeah, I couldn't take the problem of evil seriously for a long time. But when I looked at the responses, like in terms of explanations, again, my problem with theism is explanations. But here's the thing. So would it be fair to say that you would embrace some sort of neoclassical or non-classical concept of God?
If I have to. Really, I'm more convinced that moral realism is right. Yeah, and I'm just if I believed in any kind of theism, it would be non-classical, but it would only be to bridge the gap between between naturalism and moral realism.
Yeah, I have sympathies over there, and that's the main reason why when it comes to my metaethics, I am not a naturalist, because I feel that I'm non-naturalistically realist. But yeah, I think I would sympathize with that. Okay, thank you so much for your time. This was lovely to be talking to you, and hopefully we will have another discussion, this time about social epistemology in future.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was really great to talk to you.